I have a question. It's sort of rhetorical. It might become less than rhetorical if you sort of latch onto it. Thinking about the Bible and the Bible stories, especially the bigger ones, like the pattern Bible stories, as opposed to something specific like, oh, the miracle of loaves and fishes, which was one particular event at a particular point in time. Think of the broad picture. For example, when Moses led the people of Israel out of Egypt on that journey through the wilderness, the number that the Bible uses is 40. That's not ever meant to be taken literally. It just means a large number, okay? So for 40 years, a lot of years, as somebody said when I was telling them about the sermon this week, they said, why didn't you tell them to get Moses' wife to give directions? They wouldn't have taken 40 years. I said that terribly, but anyway, it was supposed to be a joke. Anyway, a long time in the desert, and comes towards the end of the journey, and Moses is up on a mountain because, and I'm not going to go into the story of all of this now, but Moses is up on a mountain, and God he's looking as the people of Israel are entering the promised land. Because of the rebellion of the people of Israel, he's not going to be allowed into the promised land. And at first he wasn't even going to be able to see it. But he bargained with God, and God said, I'll let you see it, but you're not going to enter it. Okay? Let me ask you a question. Of those, 250,000 people or maybe more, who were on that journey through the wilderness for that long number of years, how many of them do you think actually had any idea of what was going on?
Yes, they did.
All of them?
Only for one reason.
Why is that?
The day after they wanted to go and do it, and they were told God said, no, you had your chance, that's it, you're off.
Okay, so some of them were told.
Had to perish.
The one generation had to die. Okay. A generation died. What do you think? Anybody else want to give an opinion on that? Because, it seems to me that, it would be nice to put God in an airtight box. Whoops, there goes my bookmark. It would be nice to put God in an airtight box and to have it all clear and easily understandable and all the rest of that sort of stuff. And say, oh yeah, when the people of Israel put the blood on the lintel and it was Passover and all that, they all got it. Those who did it knew something was up. And they'd experienced the plagues, and there are even some non-sympathetic sources that refer to some of the plagues. So they knew something was going on, But I just sort of wonder how many had a really clear understanding that they could have said, well, yes, this is God working out his plan for the eternal kingdom that he's about the business of establishing. How many of them could have said that? I don't think too many. And another way of asking the same question is, and how old were they when they would begin to understand? 6 years old, 7 years old? Mommy, why are we wandering through the desert? Well, because this is part of God's divine plan. Well, couldn't God's divine plan mean that we could live in the suburbs and have enough to eat? So, on the one hand, God was about the business of revealing his plan and making his plan work. But on the other hand, if you sort of look at it and see the people of Israel on that journey, especially as they were entering in what was to be known as the Promised Land, how much did they understand? Maybe they suspected. Don't forget, the idea of monotheism, one God, was a relatively novel concept. They were discovering the idea of monotheism. They were discovering the idea of a relationship with God. And whenever they were confused, frightened, uncertain, what would they do? Well, they would revert back to what they knew. That often was really contrary to what God wanted. So God's purpose was to establish his kingdom, and the way he was going to do that was by Moses leading the people into the promised land. But it was sort of like the military. Adapt and overcome. Here's something hostile happening. Adapt, overcome. This isn't working out the way it was supposed to because the people rebelled. Adapt, overcome. The message came through time and time again. But for the average person, well, they might be very, very similar to us. I believe in God. I believe God has a plan and a purpose. And I believe that God is working it out somehow. But I got to tell you, sometimes when I look around the world, it doesn't seem that God is doing such a great job of it. What's going on? And I bet all through history, people have asked that question. What's going on? What's happening? And why it's happening? And I got to tell you, we're living in a day and age where it is, as much as any other time in human history, for those who believe what God's up to. What's God up to? And why doesn't he hurry it up a bit? Why doesn't he hurry it up a bit? Doesn't he see what's going on? And if he does, why doesn't he do something about it? Okay, so that is several paragraphs, in fact, several pages of where I want to head, this year, at least in the beginning part of the year. What's God up to? What's he trying to accomplish? But then also, can we begin to discern how God is going to be about the business of doing some of the things that he's doing? And I want to give you a couple of examples. The first one from the Bible, of how people have tried to figure it out and at the same time as working with God, work with the culture to advance the kingdom, but in a way people can understand, and how this tug of war, wrestling, struggle has been going on throughout the whole of history. And that doesn't mean that God is weak and ineffective, and it doesn't mean that people are necessarily stupid. It means that people and God are constantly working to come together. And when people and God come together, it's called the kingdom. So, when you think of, this is a first example, when you think of the resurrection, who are the first witnesses to the resurrection? Anybody? First witnesses to the resurrection on Easter Day. Women. Can you name one or two maybe? Mary, Martha. Okay, so Resurrection Day, the first people who are recorded in the Gospels as witnesses to the resurrection are women. Okay, now I got to say this has nothing to do with the sermon, but it's just a personal thing, so I want to throw it in. One of the things that convinced me of the truth of the resurrection was that the gospel writers wrote in that women were the first witnesses. Because if they'd been trying to sell the crowd on an idea that they didn't really believe it happened, they would never have used women as the first witnesses, because women were property, women didn't have souls, women had absolutely no social credibility. So the fact that they used women as the first witnesses to the resurrection means that they believed it. Now, by the time of the Apostle Paul, what's happened to the resurrection testimonies? Women are eliminated. Read Paul's letters, read everything from Paul, and you will not find, as part of his speaking of the resurrection, any evidence of women being present. He has eliminated them. Now, I'm not suggesting that Paul was sitting there going, geez, God made a mistake, and if he'd had any brains, he would have used men. I'm not suggesting that at all. Nor am I suggesting that Paul was writing his own gospel. Not at all. But what I am suggesting is Paul was taking a Jewish story, telling it to a Gentile audience, and he had to tell it in a way that wasn't immediately going to be dismissed. And the way you do it is not by fabricating or inventing or lying or anything like that. But parts that are problematic, you de-emphasize them. And biblically, women have always been problematic. They really have. Like, come on, folks. A 13 or 14-year-old virgin bringing the Son of God into the world? Hello? The woman at the well? The woman caught in adultery? Try to sell that. Try to sell those stories to an audience that isn't simpatico, that doesn't get it. The only way you could sell those stories of Jesus' interaction with women is if you have a pre-understanding of Jesus, who he is, and the way he works. If you don't have that understanding, you will dismiss it out of hand, and you will dismiss his followers out of hand, because it makes absolutely no cultural sense. And we can only make sense of even truth if somehow it connects with our culture. If it doesn't connect with our culture, it is absolutely meaningless. Okay? Does that make sense as a thing in and of itself? Okay, so Paul, in order for the gospel to make sense, in order to get non-believers to the point of saying, now I get it, eliminates the things that would cause them to go, whoa. So Paul wants to get on board the boat that is leading to kingdom land, and he wants to leave everything on shore that's going to sink the boat. Good way of saying it? Okay, so he eliminates the women. What I would like to suggest is that the church has, throughout its whole history, needed to do the same thing. Not lose track of the truth of the story, but present it in a way that culture can hear it. If you change the story, change the content of the story, what is the point any longer? If you wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, John and eliminated the women and said, this is the gospel. No, it isn't. You have put yourself in the place of God and edited the story. It's no longer God's gospel. It's your gospel. If you edit parts out, if you say people are going to have a wicked hard time with the resurrection, so let's downplay that. Let's just talk about Jesus as a good man and a good moral teacher. Let's just do that, because everybody likes good men and good moral teachers. Some even like good women and good moral teachers. Never mind. So you eliminate that. What do you do if you take the divinity out of Jesus? What do you got left? You got nothing left. So you don't change the story. You can't change the story. But what you can do is tell the story in a way that people in the current culture can say, I get it now. It makes sense to me now. And I got to tell you, right now, the church is doing an absolutely pathetic job of speaking the truth of the gospel in the way that our culture can internalize it and come to faith. It's become more difficult, and I'll give a couple of reasons why. One reason is, in previous generations, you know how the gospel got communicated to the next generation? Rituals and ceremonies. I'm talking about primarily the institutional church. Rituals and ceremonies. You ever hear the line, and I'm not sure whether it's actually a line that would be owned by the Roman Catholic Church, but it's certainly ascribed to the Roman Catholic Church. If you're born a Catholic, you'll die a Catholic. I've heard that. I would also say if you're born an Anglican, you'll die. I'm not going to take it any further than that. So there is the sense that, you breed, you marry and breed. Now sometimes you breed and marry, sometimes you breed and don't. Anyway, that's a different sermon. But you marry, you breed, and what do? You bring your baby to the temple on the 8th day to be circumcised. No, that's if you're Jewish. If you're Christian, you call up the minister and you say, I'd like my baby done. And the minister, being sarcastic, will say rare, medium, or well done. Because we're sick and tired of people not understanding. Now, I don't think many of us actually do that. But people just would call up and want their baby done. And the baby would get done. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of babies done. And you know why there was private baptism? Because there were so many baptisms in the olden days that you couldn't possibly have them at the main worship service of the day. You'd do nothing except baptisms. You wouldn't get to any boring hymns or anything. You could only have dumb baptisms. So you have to have private baptisms. And in some places, you do them in batches. You do batch baptisms. It's like cookies on a cookie tin or muffins in a muffin tin. You just put the mixture in, heat it up, and they're done. And then the kid goes to school, and they go to a Catholic school, or they go to a Protestant school. Protestant School Board of Greater Montreal. What's a Protestant? You know the official definition of a Protestant? When I was going through the Protestant School Board of Greater Montreal system, anything that isn't Catholic. You know, it wasn't the presence of Protestant, because we don't even know what that is. It was not Catholic. So we had Anglicans. We know they're not Protestant. We don't protest anything. Anglicans, United, Presbyterian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist. Everything that wasn't Catholic was Protestant. Okay, that leads to understanding. So, Lorne, what are you? Protestant. You know, what did that mean? Nothing. It meant nothing. It was a word that had absolutely no meaning to it, except there was this hymnal. And we would stand up in the gym for an assembly, and the hymnal was Protestant Hymns for Schools. When mothers of Salem their children brought to Jesus, the stern disciples drove them back and bade them depart. Ruth, you're singing along. That's almost frightening, but that's okay. And you look at the hymns that were in Protestant hymns, or hymns for Protestant schools, whatever it was called, and a lot of them had to do with discipline. Because, of course, Jesus wants disciplined Protestants. You know, that's what he wants. And so the whole social structure reinforced the ecclesiastical structure. Do you get where I'm going with this? You know, you're brought in, and the gospel doesn't come into it at all. You're brought into this world, and you're done. And then you're streamed into a particular socio-cultural milieu, and it has nothing to do with the gospel. And it may happen at some point that your parents talk to you about religion, but probably not. Probably not. They'll probably talk to you about how important it is to go to church, at least a little. And the older you get, they'll say how important it is for you to go to church, because they did their time. You ever heard anyone actually say that? One of our parishioners once upon a time from England, not you. Anyone else from England? I'm going to disinclude everybody from England who's here today. Not anybody now, left a long time ago, not because he didn't like us, but because he moved. He literally talked about when he was at Eton, lucky him, he did his time in chapel. Isn't that a lovely way of talking about Christianity? I did my time. Wonderful. So, when you got that, you've got culture, you've got the religious institution. You haven't, nosebleed? You haven't got gospel. And so, God's trying to work his kingdom out. People are going, what? And kingdom isn't happening. Gospel isn't happening. Oh, there's another dimension. There's always been some people who know the gospel and can speak of it. But when gospel, or when church and culture become enmeshed or embedded, usually what happens is the words get lost. The words get lost. We exchange churchianity for Christianity. We exchange traditionalism for true Christian values. And what we call true Christian values become just a social norm. And then the social norm becomes equated with good Christian values. And then society starts dictating what the church is going to be, and the church is too intimidated or inarticulate to be able to say, no, that's not what we stood for. The first two witnesses to the resurrection were women. They were. And Jesus was counterculture. Jesus was counterculture. He stood power structures on its head, and it got him in trouble. Christianity, well, it wasn't Christianity, he was a Jew. It got him in trouble. It got him in trouble with the religious leaders because they didn't like the challenge. So that's the context. That's something of how it works. What do we do? What do we do? How do we, in our generation, be like Moses, standing on that mountain or on that hill or on that cliff, wherever he was standing, watching the people going into the promised land? He knows that's what's happening. They might have some sense of it. Maybe. They probably have some sense of right and wrong. They are, after all, created in the image of God, whether they know it or not, the imago Dei. So they've got some sense of right or wrong. They're not children of God because they're not adopted as his children. That's what the gospel reading for today talks about, being adopted. And you become a child of God by adoption. You're a creation of God because you're creation. But you're a child of God when you're adopted as his child. So that's a faith thing there. How does that become clear? How does that become clear? Well, you know what? In our society, in our day, words aren't going to do it. At least not to start. Because I would propose to you that we are in almost exactly the same cultural context as the Apostle Paul found himself. That if and when we actually did get up the nerve to bring the gospel message outside the safe zone of the church, that it would fall not on deaf ears, but on ears that would be incapable of comprehending what it is that we're talking about, and would therefore try to reinterpret it in a way that makes sense in the cultural context. The resurrection would be other than we believe it is as Christians. The resurrection would no longer be about Jesus dead coming back to a physical form of life. You know what society would do to it? Society would say, well, that's ridiculous. We're not going to believe in that. But we could believe that the disciples had an experience of Jesus in their memories and their relationships and their discussions that to them was so powerful that it was almost as if Jesus rose from the dead. And the church, you know what the church will do? The church will generally go, yeah, that makes sense. We don't need the resurrection anymore. We don't need the resurrection anymore. That's what will happen. So what do you do? What do you do to be like Paul? To take the women out of the resurrection experiences, but nonetheless not disempower Easter. What do you do? How do we play ball with our cultural context in such a way that we have the type of relationships that lead to a listen, but not the type of listen based on Christianity compromising its essential core values? How do we do that? And I'm going to suggest today, one way. And again, I'm going to, just sort of give a bit of a cultural context from biblical times to set it up. As quite apart from being God, I think God's pretty smart. I think he's smart. I think he's got some really good ideas, and I think he's also pretty strategic. Of all the times, well, there hasn't ever been any time where people didn't need Jesus, but of all the times that God could have chosen for the incarnation, look at when he chose. For the first time in the history of humanity, you've got an empire that basically has, you could say, invaded, infiltrated, you could say whatever you want, the then known world. And you've got a transportation system, you've got a common language or common languages, and cultural symmetry, and merchandising and marketing, where it's a global village. Where if something happens in Jerusalem, they're going to hear about it in Rome in a couple of weeks. Okay? And that was the time, the first time in human history, that that actually happened, and that's when God chose to incarnate in Jesus. And within a generation of that incarnation, you've got this person named Saul, who becomes Paul, who is Jewish, who is culturally of the source, but who's also a Roman citizen and very cognizant of the multiplicity of what's going on there. So he has not only the basis in Judaism to understand what God's up to, but he's also got the education, the training, and the cultural acuity to be able to translate it to a Gentile culture. And that's who God chose. Now, doesn't that make sense? Doesn't that make sense? If you want your message to get known, you're not only going to talk about it to the people who have the product, who are already using the product. What you're going to do is you're going to get somebody who's connected with all sorts of people who don't use the product. That's what you're going to do. That's exactly what Paul did. That's exactly what God did in choosing Paul. And what I'd like to suggest to you is that God is doing exactly the same thing today. That God is, and the jargon term, and I couldn't think of a better one as I was putting this together, so I'm going to use the jargon term. God is raising up people within the church who have a sense that, there's nothing wrong with the message. There's nothing wrong with the message. In fact, if you look at the society out there, you see people, they might not even know it, but that are struggling to live the message because it's a good message. But they need an interpreter. And so God is raising up people to be interpreters of his plan, his kingdom plan in our society today. I want to tell you a couple of stories. And my point in telling these stories, and they're very short, don't worry, is to try to convince that there is a tremendous openness to what God wants to do and to God. A while ago, corporation and I decided that I should get more active on social media, so I've been getting Facebooky. This past week, I got a Facebook thing, I don't even know what you call them, but from somebody who I hardly knew from when I was first ordained. His sister was a member of my youth group at St. Michael's. I was close to, she was one of the core people. And I was very close to her parents, Ted and Dorothy. They're lovely people. In fact, in our family room in the basement is a pine chest that Ted, the dad, made as a thank you for the work that I had done with him. There was a brother and a sister and two parents. The dad died this week, Ted. He died at a ripe old age. Dave, the brother, the son, he was never a member of my youth group. I don't think he attended church once the whole time I was in that church. Didn't know him very well. Knew him as a passing acquaintance. We knew each other's face, each other's name. But he, because Ted died, he put a thing on Facebook for me to let me know that his dad had passed away. Why did he do that? Why did he do that? We were never friends. We were never not friends, but we were never friends. He was never a part of my life. I was never a part of his life. It just wasn't that way. But there was some connection, and I can't even tell you what it was. There was some connection that meant that when Ted died and went to heaven, he felt a need to contact me. Was it because with his dad dying, he was facing his own mortality? Was it because he knew that I had had a relationship with his dad and that I would want to know? Who knows? But there was some point of connection happening there. And when I contact him, because I will, I haven't yet, when I will, who knows what point of connection is going to happen after that. I'll tell you another one. Last year, I guess it was, maybe the year before, I'm not sure exactly. Another person from the same church, from the youth group, was Confirmation Day, 35 years ago or so, 33, 35, I forget exactly. She posted a picture of Bishop Hollis, her, and me on her Confirmation Day and said, "Do you remember this?" Of course I remember it. Of course I remember it. But why did she do that? Why? Why does she still have that picture? And why did she think of me? And why did she cyberstalk me? Just so that I could get that picture. There's something going on. There's something going on. And you know what? As an institutional structure, the church is doing an absolutely lousy job of communicating the gospel to the world around us, generally speaking. There are exceptions, but generally we're doing a lousy job of it. Previous generation, we baptized them, confirmed them, married them, and then buried them, usually when they were dead. And every now and then, we tell the children, go to church. Not why they should, but it's good for you. It was good for me. Look at that loving person it made me. And that's what we did. It was, but that's not working now. That's not working now. We need something new. We need something different. People are open to the message. They're just not hearing it from the church. So what do? Well, it seems to me like we got a lot of work to do as a church. Seems to me the first thing we need to do is talk the message. What is the gospel? I remember, Murray, you might remember this, a lot of years ago, the first youth group that I had in this very church. There was a youth group meeting at the house that I used to live in, and I was talking about the gospel, and there was this young youth group member there, not you, you know who I'm talking about, your sister, Chrissy, who said, wait a second, everybody talks about the gospel, but nobody says what it is. What's the gospel? A greater opening the prophets of old never had. People don't know what it is. We got to recover what the gospel is. What exactly is the gospel? Well, the good news is, because that's what gospel means, God's building a kingdom, and you're welcome in it. That's the good news. God's building a kingdom, and you're welcome in it. And it's a kingdom of life and love and joy, and it's nonviolent, and it's inclusive, and it's not discriminatory, and anything that's dark gets challenged, and anything that's light becomes lighter. There you go. That's what it is. That's what the gospel is about. There's a kingdom, and you're welcome in it. And you know what? When you step inside, it feels good. It feels great. And in fact, it feels so great you want to invite your friends to join too. So you better learn this stuff. So that's the gospel. And then how do we do it? We do it in ways that people can understand. This morning I mentioned just one, Facebook. There's a whole bunch of others. And none of it will replace face-to-face interactions, conversations, dialogues, relationships. But I got to tell you, when I sit in my rocking chair at 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, whenever I'm doing it, sometimes all those o'clocks in the morning, and I'm listening to the news, and I'm listening to the latest slaughter, and I'm listening to the latest murder, and I'm listening to the latest child that disappeared, and I know that it's not over there. It's just up the street. It's just up the street. We need to recover the gospel. And we need to recover the ability to communicate unchanging truth in a way that people can internalize and make their own. That's our job. That's your job. Let's pray. God, we thank you that we can come together and celebrate your presence and be reminded of things we need to be reminded of. God, right now I feel particularly inclined to pray for the generation coming up where so many of them, it's not that they've rejected you or religion. It's just that they've never been spoken to about religion at all. They just haven't got a clue what any of it is, let alone Christianity. And I just got to wonder, God, in that kind of environment and where being good and living well has been so connected with religion, once that's gone, what's left? I suspect it has something to do with every person for themselves. So I pray for our society as well. I pray for those charged with declaring a message of unchanging truth. That would be done, but with love and compassion and humility and a real caring for people. And God, I pray for our church as well. That you would bless us, that we would be open to being challenged by you to go in new directions and new ways, or old directions and old ways when that's called for. God, let this church be your church. In Jesus' name, amen. And now, as an outward and visible sign of what we always hope and pray is increasingly a spiritual reality, we stand and share in exchanging the peace. The peace of the Lord be always with you. John,